October 20th, 1944. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Japanese Imperial staff officers studied fuel consumption charts with grim satisfaction, calculating that American forces would grind to a halt within 30 days. Then, at dawn, the first convoy of 600 trucks roared onto Red Beach, and Japan's mathematical certainty collided with American audacity on a scale that would rewrite the rules of logistics warfare. The invasion of the Philippines represented General Douglas MacArthur's promised return, but it also represented something the Japanese High Command believed impossible: a sustained offensive across thousands of miles of ocean, with supply lines stretching back to Pearl Harbor and beyond. In Tokyo, military analysts had run the numbers repeatedly. Their conclusion was unanimous and reassuring: America would choke on its own ambition.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
Colonel Masanobu Tsuji stood in the war room of the Imperial General Headquarters, his finger tracing supply routes on a massive map of the Pacific. Around him, staff officers nodded as he explained the mathematics of impossibility. Every American tank required 5 gallons of fuel per hour of operation. Every transport truck consumed fuel at rates that would drain tankers faster than they could be refilled. The distances were too vast, the consumption too great, the logistics too complex. "They will land," Tsuji said with cold certainty. "They will advance. And then, like a watch that runs down, they will simply stop, not from our bullets, but from empty fuel tanks." The room murmured approval. Japan had learned this lesson the hard way in China, where supply lines stretched and snapped. Now they would watch America learn the same cruel truth. What the Japanese didn't know, what their meticulous calculations couldn't account for, was that American military logistics had evolved into something beyond traditional supply doctrine. While Japanese planners thought in terms of railroads and depots, the Americans were pioneering something revolutionary: the concept of fuel as a weapon in itself, delivered not by careful planning, but by relentless, round-the-clock trucking operations that turned supply routes into rivers of gasoline. The architect of this revolution was not a general, but a lieutenant colonel named John C.H. Lee, a logistics officer who had studied the German Autobahn system and the Soviet winter supply runs. Lee understood that modern mechanized warfare consumed fuel at rates that made traditional supply methods obsolete. His solution was radical: create a dedicated trucking operation that did nothing but move fuel, operating 24 hours a day, maintaining speeds that would seem reckless, accepting losses that would horrify peacetime planners. MacArthur, when presented with Lee's proposal, saw its genius immediately. "You're telling me we can turn supply into offense?" "Yes, sir," Lee replied. "If we move fast enough, fuel becomes advance. Every gallon delivered is another mile conquered."
The plan that emerged was named the Red Ball Express, borrowed from railroad terminology where Red Ball trains had priority over all other traffic. In the Philippines, it would mean convoys of trucks moving fuel from beach depots to forward units with absolute priority, running roads at speeds that made safety officers wince, operating through conditions that should have halted normal traffic. The first challenge was simple geography. Leyte was a jungle-covered island with roads that were barely trails, prone to flooding, undermined by monsoon rains, and completely inadequate for the tonnage the invasion would demand. Army engineers, landing with the first waves, didn't improve the roads. They built new ones, bulldozing through jungle at rates of 3 miles per day, laying crushed coral and pierced steel planking that could support 20-ton trucks loaded with fuel drums. Sergeant William McBride stood on Red Beach as the first supply convoy assembled. He had driven trucks in Louisiana, navigating roads that dissolved into mud every spring. But this was different. The trucks were GMC 6x6s, 2.5-ton workhorses painted in flat olive drab, each capable of carrying 80 drums of fuel stacked 4 high. Behind him, hundreds more trucks idled, their engines creating a mechanical thunder that rolled across the beach like an approaching storm.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Mount up!" The order passed down the line. Drivers climbed into cabs still smelling of cosmoline and factory floors. McBride settled behind the wheel of his assigned truck, designated Red Ball 47. The seat was hard, the steering heavy, and the gear shift required force that would leave his shoulder aching. But the engine ran smooth, the fuel gauge showed full, and ahead of him stretched a road that hadn't existed 3 days ago. The convoy moved out at 0600 hours, a serpent of green steel stretching for 3 miles. Each truck maintained 50-yard spacing, close enough for efficiency, far enough for safety if one hit a mine or broke down. The lead vehicle carried a white flag with a red ball painted on it, the symbol that meant all other traffic would pull aside, that bridges would be cleared, that nothing, not wounded soldiers, not supply columns, not even generals, would impede their progress. Japanese observers, hidden in the hills overlooking the invasion beaches, watched the convoy depart with confusion that would soon turn to alarm. They had expected supply trucks, normal logistics operations. What they witnessed was different in scale and intensity. One observer, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, radioed his report with growing concern. "Enemy fuel convoy. Observed. Estimated 200 vehicles. Speed excessive for terrain. This is not normal supply operation." His superiors in Manila dismissed the report. 200 trucks meant nothing in the scale of an invasion. But Tanaka understood something his commanders didn't. He had counted the convoys. This was the third he had observed in 12 hours. The Americans weren't resupplying. They were flooding the island with fuel.
The road to the front was 73 miles of newly carved track through jungle and over rivers bridged with pontoons that flexed alarmingly under the weight of loaded trucks. McBride drove with both hands gripping the wheel, feeling every rut and washout through the steering. Around him, the jungle pressed close, the kind of terrain where Japanese soldiers could hide 10 feet from the road and remain invisible. The first ambush came at mile marker 17. Machine gun fire raked the convoy from concealed positions in the tree line. Bullets sparked off truck hoods and shattered windshields. The lead truck swerved, its driver hit, and plunged off the road into a drainage ditch. The convoy didn't stop. Military police escorts returned fire while the trucks accelerated, drivers hunching below dashboard level, pressing forward because the doctrine was clear. Red Ball convoys don't stop for anything. McBride felt his truck shudder as rounds punched through the cargo bed. He prayed none hit the fuel drums, knowing that a single tracer could turn his vehicle into a fireball. The shooting lasted 30 seconds, then faded as the convoy outran the ambush zone. Behind them, the wrecked lead truck burned, its fuel drums cooking off in secondary explosions. The convoy rolled on. At the forward depot, established in a clearing carved from jungle just 8 miles from the front lines, McBride helped unload fuel drums onto wooden platforms guarded by sandbagged positions. The operation took 12 minutes. The drums were simply rolled off the truck beds and stacked. No careful inventory, no paperwork beyond a quick tally. Speed was everything. The emptied trucks turned around immediately, heading back to the beaches for another load. "How many runs today?" McBride asked the depot sergeant. "This is your second. You'll make 6 before midnight if you maintain pace." 6 runs meant 876 miles of driving through hostile territory in 18 hours. McBride calculated fuel consumption, wear on his truck, probability of mechanical failure. The numbers suggested he'd never complete the schedule. But when he climbed back into his cab, the engine started on the first turn and the road beckoned with the same urgency it had shown at dawn. The Japanese watched this operation with growing disbelief. Their intelligence reports documented convoy after convoy, moving day and night, maintaining schedules that seemed to ignore both enemy action and terrain difficulties. In Tokyo, Colonel Tsuchi received updates that contradicted his careful calculations. American tank units weren't rationing fuel, they were operating at full capacity. Attacks that should have been limited by supply constraints continued without pause. Tsuji recalculated, assuming he had underestimated American tanker capacity. But the numbers still didn't work. The fuel consumption rates he observed exceeded the delivery capacity of traditional supply methods by a factor of 3. There had to be something wrong with the intelligence, some error in observation. No military force could sustain such operations. It was mathematically impossible.
What Tsuji didn't understand was that the Red Ball Express had abandoned traditional military supply doctrine entirely. In conventional operations, fuel moved from port to depot to forward supply point through a carefully controlled chain of custody. Each transfer point meant delays, paperwork, and inevitable losses to bureaucracy. The Red Ball system eliminated all intermediate steps. Fuel went from ship to truck to tank with nothing between except speed and determination. Lieutenant Colonel Lee, observing operations from a command post near Tacloban, watched his system function with satisfaction that bordered on joy. His staff tracked every convoy, every truck, every gallon delivered. The maps on his walls showed flow rates that looked more like river systems than military supply lines. He had turned logistics into a form of offensive warfare, where the weapon wasn't bullets, but the relentless delivery of fuel that kept American armor moving when it should have been stationary. "How many gallons today?" he asked his operations officer. "As of 1400 hours, sir, we've delivered 340,000 gallons to forward units. That's 140% of planned capacity." Lee smiled. "Tomorrow we do 400,000. The Japanese are calculating our limits based on their experience. We're going to exceed those calculations until their math breaks." The human cost of this operational tempo was brutal. Drivers worked 18-hour shifts, grabbing sleep in their cabs during the brief periods when their trucks were being loaded. The roads, built for military necessity rather than safety, claimed vehicles to accidents at rates that peacetime standards would never tolerate. Ambushes, though rarely successful in stopping convoys, took steady tolls. The Red Ball Express didn't accept casualties, it absorbed them, replacing lost drivers and trucks from the endless flow of replacements arriving on the beaches. McBride completed his 6th run at 2,300 hours, having driven nearly 900 miles in 17 hours. His hands were cramped from gripping the wheel, his eyes burned from road dust and exhaust fumes, and his hearing was damaged from engine noise that had no break. But when he parked his truck in the assembly area and saw hundreds more lined up for the next day's operations, he felt something beyond exhaustion, a sense of participation in something unprecedented. The mechanic who checked his truck the next morning whistled at the odometer reading. "You put on more miles yesterday than most civilian trucks see in a month." "How's she holding up?" "Engine solid, transmission showing wear, but it'll last another week. Suspension shot, but that's normal for these roads. You're good for another day." The mechanic paused, then added, "You know they're calling this the fastest supply operation in military history? The bean counters back at headquarters are losing their minds trying to track the tonnage."
What the bean counters were discovering was that the Red Ball Express had created a new calculus of warfare. Traditional military planning assumed supply constraints would limit operational tempo. Commanders planned advances based on how far their fuel could take them, always conscious of the logistics tail that supported every forward movement. The Red Ball system inverted this relationship. Instead of supply limiting operations, operations determined supply, and the trucks simply delivered whatever was needed. Japanese commanders, receiving reports of American tank formations operating at distances that should have been impossible, began to suspect their intelligence was flawed. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, ordered a review of all supply estimates. His staff officers worked through the night, recalculating American logistics capacity, factoring in every known tanker arrival, every observed depot capacity. Their conclusion was presented to Yamashita at dawn.
Sir, based on our observations, American forces are consuming fuel at 3 times the rate their supply infrastructure can support. This is impossible unless they have developed a supply method we have not observed or understood. Yamashita studied the reports in silence. He had fought the British in Malaya, where supply lines determined victory. He understood logistics as well as any commander in the Japanese military. What his staff was telling him violated every principle he knew. "Find out how they're doing this," he ordered, "because if we don't understand their system, we cannot break it." The answer was visible from any hilltop overlooking the American advance routes, but its significance was lost in translation. Japanese observers reported truck convoys operating day and night, noting them as evidence of American material superiority, but not understanding the organizational revolution they represented. The Red Ball Express was hiding in plain sight, its trucks so numerous and constant that they seemed like normal military traffic rather than a weapon system in themselves. By the end of October, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 8 million gallons of fuel to forward American units. This single statistic represented a revolution in military thinking. Traditional supply doctrine suggested that such delivery rates would require elaborate port facilities, extensive rail networks, and months of preparation. The Americans had achieved it with trucks, roads built in days, and a willingness to accept operational losses that careful planners would reject. MacArthur, reviewing operations reports in his headquarters, recognized the strategic implications immediately. The Japanese had planned their defense of the Philippines based on the assumption that American advances would be limited by supply constraints. That assumption was now obsolete. With the Red Ball Express functioning at capacity, his forces could operate at tempos the Japanese couldn't match or counter. "How long can we sustain this?" MacArthur asked Lee during a briefing. "Sir, we're currently operating at 140% of design capacity. We can maintain this indefinitely as long as we have trucks and drivers. The system is self-sustaining. Each delivery enables the next."
MacArthur nodded slowly. "Then we don't just advance, we accelerate. Every day we move faster than the Japanese expect. We force them to react to positions they didn't know we could reach. Speed becomes strategy." This was the fundamental transformation the Red Ball Express enabled. In previous campaigns, logistics followed strategy. Armies advanced, then waited for supplies to catch up. In the Philippines, logistics and strategy merged. The ability to deliver fuel at unprecedented rates meant American forces could maintain offensive pressure that never relented, never paused, never gave the enemy time to consolidate defenses. The Japanese response, when it finally came, targeted the wrong thing. Unable to understand the Red Ball system itself, they attempted to destroy its infrastructure, attacking beach depots, bombing newly built roads, ambushing convoys. But the system was designed to absorb such losses. A destroyed depot was replaced within 24 hours. A bombed road section was bypassed or repaired before the next convoy arrived. Ambushed convoys were losses accepted within operational planning. McBride experienced this resilience firsthand when his convoy was attacked by Japanese aircraft near Karigata. 2 trucks were destroyed by strafing runs, their fuel drums exploding in orange fireballs that sent black smoke thousands of feet into the air. The convoy scattered, drivers pulling off the road and taking cover. McBride crouched in a drainage ditch, watching his truck, miraculously untouched, idle on the roadside. The attack lasted 4 minutes. When the Japanese planes departed, leaving 2 burning trucks and 1 damaged beyond repair, the convoy reformed. The burning trucks were pushed off the road by the following vehicles. The damaged truck's load was redistributed among other vehicles, each taking on additional drums. Within 12 minutes of the attack ending, the convoy was moving again, only marginally behind schedule. That evening, McBride learned that the 2 destroyed trucks had already been replaced. New drivers had been assigned, new vehicles were already making the same run he had completed. The Red Ball Express didn't mourn its losses, it incorporated them into the operational rhythm, accepting that some trucks would burn, some drivers would die, and the fuel would still be delivered. This acceptance of loss as operational cost rather than catastrophic failure was perhaps the most radical aspect of the entire system. Japanese military culture emphasized the preservation of equipment and careful husbanding of resources. The American approach, embodied in the Red Ball Express, treated trucks as consumable assets, to be used until they broke or burned, then immediately replaced. It was industrial warfare applied to logistics, and it created advantages the Japanese couldn't counter. By mid-November, Japanese fuel dumps in the Philippines were running critically low, while American forward units operated with surpluses. The reversal was so complete that American tank commanders began using fuel for purposes that would have seemed wasteful weeks before, running engines for heat, operating vehicles for short distances that could have been walked, maintaining idle times that consumed fuel without tactical benefit.
Colonel Tsuji, receiving reports of this American fuel abundance, finally understood the magnitude of the miscalculation. Japan had planned for American fuel to be a limiting factor, a constraint that would slow their advance and create opportunities for counterattack. Instead, fuel had become an American advantage, delivered in quantities that enabled operational freedom Japanese forces could only dream of. He wrote in his diary, later recovered by American forces, "We calculated their fuel capacity based on our understanding of military logistics. We were not wrong in our mathematics. We were wrong in our assumptions. The Americans have created a logistics system that operates outside traditional constraints. They deliver fuel not as careful administrators, but as reckless spenders who seem to have infinite resources. We cannot compete with infinity." The Red Ball Express had achieved something unprecedented in military history. It had turned supply into a weapon more decisive than any gun. The Japanese had entered the Philippines campaign believing mathematics was on their side, that American fuel consumption would create the victory Japanese arms could not. Instead, they discovered that American logistics had evolved beyond calculation, creating delivery systems that made mockery of careful planning. As November drew to a close, MacArthur's forces were advancing at rates that exceeded even optimistic projections. The fuel that should have been a constraint was instead an enabler, delivered in trucks that never stopped, driven by men who accepted impossible schedules as normal routine. The Red Ball Express had become the steel heart of the American advance, pumping fuel through newly built arteries to forces that moved with a freedom that seemed to violate the laws of military logistics. The Japanese had thought America would run out of fuel. Instead, they were drowning in it, watching their defensive calculations collapse under the weight of delivery systems that shouldn't have been possible, but functioned anyway. Mile after mile, gallon after gallon, convoy after convoy, until the mathematics of impossibility became the reality of defeat. December arrived with monsoon rains that turned the Philippine roads into rivers of mud. The Japanese High Command watched these downpours with renewed hope, calculating that even American determination couldn't overcome the basic physics of weather. Trucks would bog down, roads would dissolve, and the Red Ball Express would finally grind to the halt that mathematics had always predicted. They were wrong again. The engineers who had built the initial road network had anticipated the monsoon season. Before the first heavy rains fell, they had already begun transforming the dirt tracks into all-weather routes, using a technique borrowed from Pacific Island construction. Crushed coral, dredged from coastal waters and hauled inland, was laid in thick beds over the existing roads. On top of this, they placed pierced steel planking, interlocking metal sheets originally designed for temporary airfields, creating surfaces that could handle heavy loads even when water flowed across them. Sergeant McBride experienced the transformation firsthand when his convoy approached a section of road that had been impassable mud just 48 hours earlier. Now it was a metal highway,
water sluicing across the steel planking but the surface remaining firm. His truck's tires sang against the metal, a high-pitched whine that replaced the grinding sound of wheels fighting through mud. The convoy's speed, which should have dropped to a crawl in monsoon conditions, remained at 30 miles per hour. Major Robert Palmer, the engineer officer responsible for this section of road, stood in the rain watching the convoy pass. Water streamed off his helmet, but his expression showed satisfaction. "We're not fighting the weather," he explained to a visiting correspondent. "We're building through it. Every night we add another mile of all-weather surface. The Japanese think rain is their ally. We've made it irrelevant." This ability to neutralize environmental obstacles was perhaps the Red Ball Express's most devastating advantage. Japanese defensive planning had relied on natural barriers, rivers, mountains, and weather, to slow American advances. Each of these obstacles had been systematically overcome through engineering that operated on the same relentless schedule as the fuel convoys. Rivers were bridged within hours of American forces reaching them. Mountains were bypassed by roads that switchbacked up slopes at grades that would terrify civilian drivers. And now, weather itself had been engineered into irrelevance. In Manila, General Yamashita received reports of American truck operations continuing unabated through conditions that should have immobilized them. He stood at the window of his headquarters, watching rainfall in sheets that reduced visibility to mere yards. Somewhere out there, American trucks were moving through identical conditions, delivering fuel that would enable tomorrow's advance. The thought was almost incomprehensible. "How many trucks do they have?" he asked his intelligence officer. "Our estimates suggest between 800 and 1,000, sir, but the number seems to increase weekly. They replace losses faster than we can inflict them."
Yamashita nodded slowly. "They're not just supplying an army. They've turned supply into the army itself. Every truck is a soldier that never sleeps, never retreats, never stops advancing." He paused, then added quietly, "We cannot win against an enemy who treats logistics as warfare." The Japanese general's assessment was more accurate than he knew. Back at Red Ball headquarters, Lieutenant Colonel Lee had refined the operation into a science that bordered on art. His staff tracked not just fuel delivery, but delivery rates, turnaround times, and what they called fuel velocity, the speed at which gasoline moved from ship to combat vehicle. The goal was no longer simply to deliver fuel, but to deliver it faster than it could be consumed, creating surpluses that enabled spontaneous operations the Japanese couldn't predict or counter. By December 15th, the Red Ball Express had achieved what Lee called logistics dominance. American forward units had fuel reserves for 3 days of intensive operations, an unheard-of surplus in combat conditions. This abundance enabled tactical flexibility that Japanese commanders accustomed to fuel-starved operations couldn't comprehend. American tank units could pursue retreating Japanese forces without checking fuel gauges. Artillery could relocate multiple times per day without worrying about the fuel cost of movement. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was devastating. Soldiers defending positions watched American armor advance, expecting the attacks to pause as fuel ran low. Instead, the attacks intensified, supported by a logistics system that seemed to have no limits. One Japanese lieutenant, captured near Ormoc, told his interrogators, "We were told to hold for 3 days, that American fuel would run out. We held for 5 days. The Americans never slowed. How do you fight an enemy whose supplies never diminish?" The answer, though the lieutenant couldn't know it, was visible on every road leading to the front. Convoys moved day and night now, their schedules coordinated with such precision that trucks arriving at depots found their predecessors just pulling out. The system had achieved a kind of perpetual motion, where the cycle of delivery, unloading, and return created a continuous flow that never broke. McBride had driven the same route so many times he could navigate it in darkness without headlights, following the feel of the road through his steering wheel.
He knew every curve, every rough patch, every place where Japanese snipers might be hiding. The road had become as familiar as his hometown streets, except these streets were arteries pumping fuel to a war that consumed it with insatiable hunger. On his 47th run, he'd stopped counting after 50, McBride's truck finally succumbed to the brutal operational tempo. The transmission, worn beyond repair by constant use, simply gave up on a grade 15 miles from the forward depot. The grinding sound was followed by silence as the truck coasted to a halt. McBride sat behind the wheel for a moment, almost feeling sympathy for the machine that had carried him through ambushes, air attacks, and impossible schedules.
The recovery system activated immediately. Within 20 minutes, a wrecker appeared, towed his disabled truck to the roadside, and transferred his fuel drums to another vehicle. McBride was assigned to a replacement truck, this one fresh from the depot, still carrying the smell of new paint, and continued his run. The entire delay cost 37 minutes. By evening, his broken truck had been stripped for parts, its usable components already being installed in other vehicles. This ruthless efficiency in managing mechanical casualties was another Japanese miscalculation. Their intelligence had correctly identified American truck losses to mechanical failure, ambush, and accident. What they hadn't understood was the replacement rate. For every truck that broke down or burned, 2 more arrived from the steady stream of vessels unloading at the beaches. The Red Ball Express wasn't just operating, it was growing, expanding its capacity even as it sustained losses. Lieutenant Colonel Sakamoto, a Japanese logistics officer, studied captured American documents with growing despair. The maintenance schedules he found recommended truck replacement every 6 weeks under combat conditions. 6 weeks. Japanese trucks were expected to last 6 months, carefully maintained and sparingly used. The Americans were treating vehicles as consumable ammunition, using them until they broke, then discarding them for fresh ones. It was wasteful, excessive, and utterly effective. Christmas approached, and with it came a transformation that symbolized the complete reversal of fortunes. American supply officers, noting the fuel surplus, authorized what would have been unthinkable weeks before. Christmas lights powered by generators running on gasoline delivered by the Red Ball Express. Forward positions that should have been dark and fuel-starved instead blazed with improvised decorations, their generators consuming fuel that Japanese units would have hoarded for weeks. MacArthur, visiting a forward command post on Christmas Eve, found officers planning operations with a casualness that spoke to their supreme confidence in supply. "We're looking at a 3-pronged advance," one colonel explained, pointing to a map. "It'll require moving 2 armored battalions 60 miles in 2 days. "Fuel?" MacArthur asked. "Not a constraint, sir. The Red Ball Express can deliver whatever we need, whenever we need it." MacArthur nodded, but inwardly he marveled at the transformation. Just months ago, such an operation would have required weeks of preparation, careful fuel accumulation, and acceptance that the advance might stall if supply couldn't keep pace. Now, fuel was so abundant that it had ceased to be a planning factor. Lee's system had achieved the impossible. It had made logistics invisible by making it overwhelming.
The Japanese New Year brought no celebration. Yamashita's forces, compressed into an ever-shrinking defensive perimeter, faced fuel shortages so severe that vehicles were abandoned for lack of gasoline to move them. Artillery pieces sat silent because moving them to new positions would consume fuel needed for the retreat. Japanese soldiers, watching American vehicles move with casual abundance, understood that they were being defeated not by superior tactics, but by superior supply. In Tokyo, Colonel Tsuji prepared his final assessment of the Philippines campaign. His report, brutally honest, acknowledged the fundamental miscalculation. We assumed American logistics would follow conventional patterns, limited by distance and consumption rates. Instead, They created a new form of logistics that operates without apparent constraint. The Red Ball Express is not a supply system. It is a weapon system that uses fuel as ammunition. We have no counter to this approach because our entire military doctrine assumes supply is a limiting factor. The Americans have made it an enabling factor. The report was filed, but changed nothing. Japan's industrial capacity couldn't replicate the American approach even if the doctrine was understood. The trucks, the fuel, the organizational capacity to coordinate such operations all were beyond Japanese capability at this stage of the war. They could see the weapon that was defeating them, but lacked the means to counter it. By late January 1945, American forces had advanced across Luzon with a speed that exceeded even MacArthur's optimistic projections. The Red Ball Express had delivered over 15 million gallons of fuel, supporting operations that covered distances the Japanese had calculated would require months. The mathematics of impossibility had been overwhelmed by the reality of industrial might applied with innovative doctrine. McBride, now driving his 7th replacement truck, made his 127th run on January 28th. The route had changed, extended now to forward positions that were 60 miles closer to Manila than the original depots. But the operation remained the same. Load fuel, drive forward, unload, return, repeat. The monotony was broken only by the constant awareness that each run supported advances that were winning the war 1 gallon at a time. The fall of Manila in February marked the effective end of organized Japanese resistance in the Philippines, though fighting would continue for months. When American forces entered the city, they found Japanese fuel dumps empty, vehicles abandoned for lack of gasoline to move them, and defensive positions undermanned because troops couldn't be moved to where they were needed. The fuel shortage the Japanese had predicted for American forces had instead become their own death sentence. Lieutenant Colonel Lee, surveying the captured city, allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction. The Red Ball Express had delivered 22.3 million gallons of fuel across some of the most difficult terrain in the Pacific. It had operated through monsoons, ambushes, air attacks, and mechanical breakdowns without ever failing to meet demand. The system he had designed on paper had exceeded every expectation in practice.
"What's next?" his operations officer asked. Lee studied the map on the wall, his finger tracing potential routes to new objectives. "We refine it, make it faster, more efficient. The Pacific is vast, and every island we take will need this system. We've proven it works in the Philippines, now we scale it for the rest of the war." What Lee was describing would become reality in the campaigns to come. The Red Ball Express model, proven in the Philippines, would be replicated in Okinawa, planned for the invasion of Japan itself. The logistics revolution that had begun with trucks and coral roads would evolve into a doctrine that would influence military supply operations for generations. The human cost of this achievement was sobering. The Red Ball Express had lost 183 trucks to enemy action, 347 to mechanical failure, and 89 to accidents. 42 drivers had been killed, 127 wounded. But these numbers, tragic as they were, represented a casualty rate far lower than the infantry units the convoys supported. The system had been brutal in its demands, but efficient in its execution, achieving maximum results with acceptable losses. Sergeant McBride, awarded a Bronze Star for his service with the Red Ball Express, tried to explain the experience to a reporter visiting the motor pool. "We weren't heroes," he said, uncomfortable with the attention. "We were just drivers doing a job. But the job was different from anything anyone had done before. We moved fuel like it was water, constant and endless. The Japanese thought they could calculate when we'd run dry. They didn't understand that we'd turn calculation into irrelevance." The reporter, searching for a dramatic quote, asked, "So you beat them with trucks?" McBride thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, we beat them with trucks, and fuel, and roads that shouldn't have existed, and a schedule that should have been impossible.
We beat them by making supply into offense, by turning every gallon of gas into territory captured. They fought with soldiers. We fought with logistics. Turns out, logistics wins. The final assessment of the Philippines campaign, compiled by military historians after the war, identified the Red Ball Express as a decisive factor in the speed of American victory. Japanese defensive planning had been sound, their positions well chosen, their soldiers determined. But all of these advantages were neutralized by an American supply system that enabled operational tempos the defenders couldn't match. General Yamashita, surrendering in the mountains of northern Luzon in September 1945, was asked by his captors what had surprised him most about American operations. His answer was immediate: your trucks, not your planes or your ships or your tanks, your trucks. You moved fuel with such abundance that distance became meaningless. We calculated that supply would limit you. Instead, supply freed you. That was the difference between our defeat and your victory.
The Red Ball Express stood down in the Philippines in March 1945, its mission accomplished. The trucks were redistributed to other operations, the drivers reassigned, the corral roads left to the jungle that would slowly reclaim them. But the legacy remained, embedded in military doctrine and strategic thinking. The United States had proven that modern warfare could be won not through superior tactics or braver soldiers, but through logistics elevated to the level of weaponry. In the decades that followed, military planners would study the Red Ball Express as a case study in innovation under pressure. The system that had seemed impossible on paper, trucks operating at speeds that guaranteed mechanical failure, roads built in days instead of months, convoys running through hostile territory without pause, had worked because it embraced risk as operational necessity rather than something to be avoided. The Japanese had thought America would run out of fuel, that mathematics and distance would create the victory their arms could not. Instead, they discovered that American industrial might, combined with innovative thinking, could overcome calculations that seemed absolute. MacArthur had indeed unleashed the Red Ball Express, and in doing so had unleashed a new form of warfare where supply lines became supply weapons, where logistics became offense, and where fuel delivery became the difference between stalemate and victory. The roads in the Philippines, those coral and steel arteries that had pumped fuel to the front, gradually disappeared. Jungle reclaimed the cuts through mountains. Rivers washed away the pontoon bridge sites. Rain eroded the coral beds until only traces remained. But the concept? The understanding that modern war could be won through relentless, overwhelming logistics endured. The last Red Ball Express convoy in the Philippines rolled out on March 15, 1945. McBride was driving, his 8th truck now, following a route he could navigate blindfolded. The fuel drums in his cargo bed would support operations he'd never see, victories he'd never witness. But as he drove through the night, following the red ball flag of the lead truck, he understood that he'd been part of something unprecedented.
The Japanese had calculated that America would run out of fuel. They had been meticulous in their math, careful in their planning. But they had failed to account for American audacity, for the willingness to build roads through jungles in days, to drive trucks until they broke, to treat supply as a weapon rather than a constraint. That miscalculation had cost them the Philippines and ultimately the war. The engine of McBride's truck hummed steadily as he drove into the darkness, carrying fuel that represented more than gasoline. It represented the triumph of industrial power over strategic calculation, of relentless execution over careful planning, of logistics transformed into the most decisive weapon of modern war. Behind him, the Philippines campaign was ending. Ahead, the road stretched into darkness, illuminated only by the headlights of trucks that never stopped moving, carrying fuel that never ran out, supporting an advance that never paused. The Red Ball Express had proven that in modern warfare, the side that controls supply doesn't just support victory, it creates it, 1 gallon at a time, one truck at a time, one impossible mile at a time.